All right, so we begin our top 36 wide receiver rankings for week one with wide receivers that could end up as high end wide receiver threes. At 36, I have Rome Odunze of the Bears. At 35, I have Calvin Ridley of the Titans. At 34, I have George Pickens of the Steelers. And at 33, I have Deontay Johnson of the Panthers. All right, so this ranking of Rome Odunze is under the assumption that he is a starting wide receiver in two wide receiver sets. He is, in my opinion, by far the best fit for the X in this Bears offense. He's 6'3", 212 pounds, is a vertical threat. He should fit the DK Metcalf role in Shane Waldron's offense that he was running in Seattle. So I think it by far makes the most sense. You can play Moore or Allen at X, but it would just be much better for the offense for Rome to be in the X, for DJ Moore to be in the Z, and Allen to be in the slot. But I could be wrong. So that is under that assumption. But if he is the starting wide receiver in two wide receiver sets, he carries a ton of weekly upside. It's just this also isn't the best matchup. He is going to have to go against L'Jarius Sneed now. I think that Sneed is more than likely going to roll with DJ Moore, though, because DJ Moore is an established receiver, and I think that's what they'll probably end up doing with Tennessee. We'll have to see if L'Jarius Sneed travels or if he just sticks to one side of the field. So we'll have to see, though. At 35, I have Calvin Ridley against Chicago. It definitely is not the most intriguing matchup. Jalen Johnson is probably going to be on him for a lot of the game. Maybe Kyler Gordon, depending on exactly where they line up Calvin Ridley. The good news is Calvin Ridley's likely not to be misused as he was in Jacksonville. He was used as an X wide receiver a lot on the line of scrimmage. He's best used as a Z. Now, the Titans have DeAndre Hopkins, a classic X receiver, so I think Hopkins is going to be the X, allowing Calvin Ridley to have free releases. And so my outlook on Calvin Ridley is a lot higher than it was this past season. I just think that this matchup it really isn't the best, and I want to see what his connection with Will Levis looks like before I start ranking him a little bit higher, especially with some of these receivers arguably being better and having more established positions in their offense. At 34, I have George Pickens against Atlanta. It isn't the best matchup in the world. He is going to have to contend with AJ Terrell a good amount. And with Russell Wilson or Justin Fields being his quarterback, really the difference between them and Kenny Pickett is probably negligible. He is the number one option on this offense. It's just with the probable lack of quarterback play and with Arthur Smith's scheme being brought in, I'm really not as high on Pickens as I normally would be. At 33, I have Deontay Johnson against New Orleans. So while I like Deontay Johnson being connected to Bryce Young a little bit more than I did him, Kenny Pickett, and I like the Dave Canales offense in general, I do worry that he's going to get matched up with Marshawn Lattimore. Marshawn Lattimore is one of the premier cornerbacks in terms of his physical coverage. So I don't like that matchup, and for that reason, he's a little bit lower than he is going to be most weeks for me. This next tier has the potential to be at best mid wide receiver twos, but more than likely at best to be low-end wide receiver twos. At 32, we have Amari Cooper. At 31, Chris Godwin. At 30, Zay Flowers. At 29, Christian Kirk. At 28, Terry McLaurin. At 27, Tank Dell. And 26, T. Higgins. At 32, we have Amari Cooper. He goes against Dallas. Now, the good news is Deron Bland is likely to miss the first 4 games of the season and is almost certainly not going to be back for week 1. So that is good news. He does have to potentially face Trayvon Diggs, but Trayvon Diggs is less of a shutdown corner and more of a playmaker on defense. So while I think that ultimately this is going to be a favorable game script for them passing, I think Dallas is going to be leading. I think that with him being the only receiver that they need to fear at all, it's going to potentially get a lot more defensive attention headed towards him, as well as the fact that Deshaun Watson has just not looked good recently, and Amari Cooper was much less of an upside play with Deshaun Watson than he was with Joe Flacco, for instance. So we'll have to see about that, but for now I have him down here. At 31, I have Chris Godwin against Washington. It's definitely not a very good matchup. Now, the good news is, without the ironic thing is with Dave Canales there, it helped the offense in general, but it didn't help Chris Godwin because he was playing more flanker than slot. He essentially played about half as many snaps in the slot this past season as he did in 2022. So there have been a lot of reports that he's going to be used way more often in the slot, which will help him. So I think he does have the safe floor this week. I just think that in a bad matchup, his ceiling probably isn't that high. At 30, we have Zay Flowers against Kansas City. I think there's a good chance that Kansas City gets well ahead in this game, or at best, it's a potential shootout kind of a game that's close. So I think Zay Flowers does have some upside. I just worry that with him really being the only wide receiver there that they have to worry about, there is the potential for them to give him a little bit of extra coverage. There is the potential that let's say that Baltimore is winning, they're probably just going to salt the game in with Derrick Henry. So I think that Mark Andrews is more the upside play this week in the passing game. And obviously Lamar Jackson is a solid play, and you're probably playing Derrick Henry. I think Zay Flowers is a fine flex play for you, or wide receiver 3. He's okay if he's your wide receiver 2, but it'd be preferable if he's your 3 or flex. At 29, we have Christian Kirk against Miami. I expect this to be an absolute shootout of a game. So I think Christian Kirk is a potential upside play. It's just with Brian Thomas Jr. being there and Gabe Davis, I project them to be the starting wide receivers in 2 wide receiver sets. So I think when they run 11 personnel, Kirk will be on the field. So I think that limits his potential upside in that he might not be on the field quite as much. There's also a lot of mouths to feed in Jacksonville. So I think that his ceiling is a little bit more limited than has been, but he possesses a very, very safe floor and does have touchdown upside this week. Terry McLaurin at 28. Tampa Bay is just not a good matchup for him. He is easily the wide receiver 1, and I think in an easier matchup, I would have him a lot higher than this. Tank Dell at 27. So the issue with Tank Dell is that there is a lot of target competition now with Stephon Diggs and Nico Collins there, as well as Dalton Schultz and Joe Mixon. So I think he's going to be an inconsistent week-to-week player for us, but he does have potential for massive boom weeks when he does play well. And by play well, I mean just happens to get more targets and a more favorable matchup. So for that reason, I think he's going to be the often 3rd most targeted wide receiver on this team. So he's going to be a little bit lower than I would like to rank him based off of his talent. At wide receiver 26, I have T. Higgins against New England. Now, I do think he's a little bit overrated as a receiver, but he is a very good jump ball receiver. The only potential issue is they should easily be beating New England. And so I expect Cincinnati to run the ball a lot in the second half. So I think that the potential passing volume for the Bengals this week is going to be a little bit lower. So for that reason, he's going to be my wide receiver 26, but he does have the ability to be a mid wide receiver 2 if he does happen to get a touchdown. This next tier of wide receivers are wide receivers with, at best, low-end wide receiver 1 upside, but more than likely, at best, high-end wide receiver 2 upside. This is a large tier of players, so they could finish anywhere, in my opinion, from 16 to 25 generally. Some are in better situations, but are a little bit less talented, in my opinion, and some are a little more talented, but in worse situations. And at wide receiver 25, I have DK Metcalf. At 24, Stephon Diggs. 23, Devontae Smith. 22, DJ Moore. 21, Rashee Rice. 20, Malik Neighbors. 19, Brandon Ayuk. 18, Michael Pittman Jr. 17, Mike Evans. And 16, Nico Collins. DK Metcalf is playing Denver. He is going to have to contend with Pat Surtain. I think they're going to have him cover him. He is a really talented receiver, and he should be the most targeted wide receiver on the team. I just think it's a really bad matchup, even though Denver overall isn't the most stingy pass defense. And at 24, I have Stephon Diggs against Indianapolis. Now that he's in Houston, we're going to have to see what his target share looks like. I think he has a chance to be the most targeted wide receiver. I think it's going to be between him and Nico Collins. I do think that Nico Collins gets a couple more targets in this game than Stephon Diggs does. Either way, it's an inviting matchup. It's going to be probably a very high scoring game, so there is touchdown upside. It's just, what is the overall volume and target situation going to look like? At 23, Devontae Smith against Green Bay. That's a very good matchup for him. The only issue is he's behind A.J. Brown in the pecking order. They have Dallas Goedert there. They brought in Saquon Barkley as well, so I think they're going to be running the ball a little bit more. So he has the potential to be the odd man out from week to week, but I would definitely start him with confidence as a solid wide receiver too. At 22, we have DJ Moore. It is a bad matchup against the Titans. They do have L'Jarius Sneed now, and I do worry that Sneed is going to be covering DJ Moore a majority of the time. If so, that's going to be very, very tough for him. Sneed is one of the premier cover corners, as well as the fact that they have Rome Odunze and Keenan Allen there now, along with Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett, and even DeAndre Swift. So it's a very, very crowded place. As soon as next year, I think that DJ Moore returns to being a top 15 receiver most weeks. But for this season, I'm going to be cautiously optimistic about him. But week 1 is just not the best matchup. At 21, I have Rashee Rice. Now, the good news for him is that Hollywood Brown's out. The bad news, they have Xavier Worthy, they still have Travis Kelce, and they still have Pacheco. So I think he's going to be a very safe floor player, but I think his ceiling is going to be a little bit limited. Although I would definitely start him with confidence as a fine wide receiver 2, hopefully your wide receiver 3, though. At 20, I have Malik Nabers against Minnesota. Now, this is definitely not an inviting matchup. Stephon Gilmore is there now. I worry that he travels with Nabers, and it's really even more so that Daniel Jones is throwing on the ball. So I'm going to be cautiously optimistic with Nabers. If he were to have a decent quarterback, I mean, seriously, just average, he would be a top 10 candidate weekly for me. I know he's going to receive a ton of targets. We'll just have to see how this season plays out, and it's really just not the best matchup facing Gilmore. At 19, I have Brandon Ayuk against the Jets. Now, he's likely going to face Sauce Gardner a good amount of the game, so that's just about the worst matchup in football. The other side isn't really any easier, so it's a very poor matchup. I think Debo is the play this week. In most weeks, you're going to have to start him anyways because he's probably your wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2. This is just not the best matchup, though. At 18, I had Michael Pittman against Houston. This is a very, very, very friendly matchup for him. He's probably not going to face Stingley quite as much because they're going to use him at Z and probably get him in the slot some to avoid that matchup. It's just the accuracy of A-Rich isn't the best. So he's probably going to be a very safe floor player because he's going to receive massive amounts of volume. He's just not a high touchdown scorer throughout his career. So I think he's a safe play, but I don't think he has the most upside, although it is a friendly matchup. At 17, I have Mike Evans against Washington. It's really not a friendly matchup at all. He's still going to be their X wide receiver and their first target in the offense. It's just with Dave Canales no longer being there, I do expect a little bit of regression, and it's, once again, just not a friendly matchup. Usually he'd be a little bit higher in these rankings. At 16, I have Nico Collins against Indianapolis. That is a friendly matchup. I think that Nico Collins is the play this week. He's going to be starting at X for them. He has a special connection with CJ Stroud. He would be a little bit higher in these rankings, but with them having Diggs and Dell, as well as Dalton Schultz and Joe Mixon, I worry about the consistency with him, but it's a friendly matchup, and he's shown us incredible amounts of upside this past season. So you're definitely starting him. This next tier of wide receivers, I think, are going to either be high-end 2s to low-end 1s. At 15, we have Chris Olave. At 14, Devontae Adams. At 13, Cooper Kupp. At 12, Jalen Waddle. And at 11, Deebo Samuel. At 15, I have Chris Olave against the Panthers. He's likely going to be funneled a lot of targets. With Derek Carr being his quarterback, it's hard to rank him much higher, even in a favorable matchup. I think once he gets a decent quarterback, he's going to skyrocket. It's just until then, it's kind of a safe floor but limited ceiling thing. But I do think in a good matchup, he has a safe floor. At 14, we have Devontae Adams facing off against the Chargers. So the Chargers are going to be now led by Jim Harbaugh, a defensive-minded head coach. I think their defense is going to be a lot more stingy. In terms of his quarterback play, it is arguable that he has a better quarterback this season in Gardner Minshew, who's the starter now. The only issue is now they also have Brock Bowers, so his 33% target share is probably dipping to 28 to 30%. So that does limit his ceiling a little bit more, considering he's still going to have poor quarterback play, most likely. He's still a relatively safe receiver because he's going to receive massive amounts of volume and still be the number 1 target. It's just, this is not the best matchup for him. At 13, I have Cooper Kupp against Detroit. Now, I have Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua in the top 13. I think this is going to be an absolute barn burner of a matchup. I think Cooper Kupp is going to return to form now that he's healthy. It's really not a bad matchup at all. Even though they drafted multiple cornerbacks, I don't, unless somebody is a premier top shelf cornerback, you figure they're probably going to struggle a little bit in their first couple of games as a rookie. So I think that with how good Sean McVay is as an offensive mastermind, and with him having Matt Stafford as his quarterback, they have a special connection, and Cooper Kupp is one of the better man beaters in the NFL. His success rate versus man is very, very good. So I think this is going to be a high output game for him and Nakua. At wide receiver 12, I have Jalen Waddle against Jacksonville. I think this is also going to be a shootout game. He's kind of a streaky player, and then he gets you a lot of 10-point games, but then he gets you 30 and 40-point games. I think this has the potential to be one of those 30-point games for him. Jacksonville is definitely not the scariest matchup by any means. It's just he is a little bit streaky, so very high ceiling, and you're definitely starting him. At 11, I have Deebo Samuel against the Jets. I do think Sauce Gardner is primarily going to be on Brandon Ayuk. I do think they're going to be using Deebo Samuel in the run game on motions. So I do like Deebo Samuel a little bit more this week. Somebody's going to have a decent game against the Jets, and I think it's going to be him rather than Brandon Ayuk. The next tier of wide receivers are likely top 10. I think they're likely mid to low end wide receiver ones this week. At 10, we have Marvin Harrison Jr. At 9, Drake London. At 8, Puka Nacua. All right, so Marvin Harrison Jr., we haven't seen a snap from him at the NFL level in terms of a regular season game yet. However, he faces off against Buffalo, who lost Tre'Davious White and both starting safeties, so I think this is a very friendly matchup. I'm being honestly a little bit conservative in my opinion because he does have Kyler Murray throwing him the ball, and we've all seen what Kyler Murray can do with a dominant X receiver like Hopkins. So I think he's a very safe bet to be a low-end wide receiver 1 with very, very solid upside this week. I think he's absolutely the real deal. At 9, I have Drake London against Pittsburgh. It's not the most inviting matchup, but now that they have the Rams game as well as Cousins or Penix at quarterback, the sky is the absolute limit. The Rams generally funnel their offense through 1 or 2 targets. I think him and Pitts are going to eat. So even in a less than ideal matchup, I think that Drake London is a safe bet due to the immense volume that he's going to receive. At 8, I have Puka Nacua against Detroit. It's, I think, a friendly matchup because even though they drafted multiple cornerbacks, Detroit did, they're rookies and they weren't elite top shelf prospects. They're just good prospects. So I think that Puka Nacua is going to eat. I think he's going to receive a ton of volume. And I think that he is a little bit better than Cooper Kupp at this stage of his career, although I think both of them are going to eat. And it's going to be a very high scoring game. This tier consists of the studs. These are, in my opinion, the 7 most talented wide receivers in the NFL. We have A.J. Brown at 7, Garrett Wilson at 6, Justin Jefferson at 5, Jamar Chase at 4, Amon-Ra at 3, Tyreek at 2, and CD at 1. And so at 7, I have A.J. Brown facing off against Green Bay. It is a very inviting matchup. He may have to deal with Jaire Alexander a little bit, so that does potentially limit his ceiling, although he's one of the most talented ex-wide receivers in the NFL. I do worry that this offense may be a little bit more spread out with Kellen Moore there. There is also the potential that they run the ball more in the red zone with Barkley. So I think that his upside this season could be a little bit capped compared to what it's been, but he's still one of the premier talents, and he does possess massive amounts of weekly upside. At 6, I have Garrett Wilson against San Fran. It is not an inviting matchup. However, with Aaron Rodgers throwing him the ball, and with him being by far the most talented wide receiver in this wide receiver room, I think we're finally going to get the Garrett Wilson that we've known he could have been for the past 2 seasons. And in more inviting matchups, he's going to be listed higher. This guy is one of the best man-beating wide receivers in the NFL. If Zach Wilson or any of the other quarterbacks he's had were capable of throwing for more than 10 yards accurately, he would have been eating. And it's finally time for him to shine. There's just equally to a little bit more talented wide receivers with better matchups ahead of him. All right, so at 5, I have Justin Jefferson against the Giants. It's Justin Jefferson. He's as QB-proof as any wide receiver in the NFL. He's going to eat. KOC has a wonderful scheme going. There's just every one of these quarterbacks ahead of him is connected to a much better quarterback. So with them being in roughly equal or better matchups, I have them slightly ahead of Jefferson, even though he's, in my opinion, actually the most talented wide receiver in the NFL. All right, so at 4, I have Jamar Chase against New England. So there is the potential for them to start blowing out New England. I think that Jamar Chase, though, is finally going to have good quarterback play now that he has Burrow again. So as long as Burrow stays healthy, Chase has the upside for a 50-point game anytime. I do think he's going to start out hot, and then they're going to be passing a little bit less after halftime. So I do think I would like to have him a little bit higher in these rankings, but I think the volume may not be there in the second half of the game because it'll probably be a blowout. Then at 3, we have Amon-Ra St. Brown against the Rams. I think it's going to be an absolute shootout of a game. He's one of the safest wide receivers. In a full-point PPR, he only had 1 game of less than 10 points this past season. He's about as good of a bet as any to have 20 points just about every week. He has sky high potential, and we'll see if he's able to improve upon his finish this season. He's one of the best slot receivers in the NFL. He can play X, and he can be used as a flanker as well. It's a wonderful offense in Detroit. And at 2, I have Tyreek Hill against Jacksonville. He's as good as a bet like Amon-Ra is to have 20 points. For him to have 30 points in any given game, I think this is going to be a shootout. I think he's probably going to have a 30-point game, to be honest with you. And at 1, I have CeeDee Lamb. I think he's going to be the most targeted wide receiver in the NFL once again. He doesn't have the best matchup, but it doesn't really matter. Dak Prescott is his quarterback. He's going to be throwing dots to him. He's going to be probably getting 15 or more targets this week. He's just about the safest wide receiver there is, and he has a massive ceiling. We'll see if he builds upon this past season. It'd be really hard to have a better season, but he's still below the age apex of 26, so he still should be getting better. And once again, you can't go wrong with any of these wide receivers in this tier. All right, so to conclude, the wide receivers that could be high-end wide receiver 3s are Rome Odunze, Calvin Ridley, George Pickens, and Deontay Johnson. Wide receivers that could be at best mid, but probably low-end wide receiver 2s are Amari Cooper, Chris Godwin, Zay Flowers, Christian Kirk, Terry McLaurin, Tank Dell, and T. Higgins. Wide receivers that could be high-end wide receiver 2s or potentially low-end wide receiver 1s are DK Metcalf, Stephon Diggs, Devontae Smith, DJ Moore, Rashee Rice, Malik Neighbors, Brandon Ayuk, Michael Pittman Jr., Mike Evans, and Nico Collins. Likely high-end wide receiver 2s with wide receiver 1 upside are Chris Olave at 15, Devontae Adams at 14, Cooper Kupp at 13, Jalen Waddle at 12, and Deebo Samuel at 11. Then likely top 10 wide receivers are Marvin Harrison Jr., Drake London, and Puka Nacua. Once again, I'd like to rank Marvin Harrison Jr. a little bit higher, but I do want to see 1 week of him. It is a very advantageous matchup for him, though. And at tier 1, we have A.J. Brown, Garrett Wilson, Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Amon-Ra, Tyreek, and CeeDee. These guys are you're going to be starting a good amount of these wide receivers on this list no matter what. But these guys are locked and loaded wide receiver 1s. As long as their quarterback play is good enough, and for some of them it doesn't even matter, you're going to be starting these players and start them with confidence. All right, so those are my top 36 wide receivers for week 1 of the fantasy season. Who did I miss? Who would you have a little bit higher or lower? Let me know below in the comment section. If you need any start-sit advice, feel free to ask below in the comment section as well. I'm going to be releasing weekly rankings for quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends for every week of the season. Feel free to check out my other rankings videos for week 1 as they come out. And if you like seeing videos like this and want to see more in the future, feel free to like and subscribe. I'm going to have these once again every single week. With that being said, I'm the Fantasy Football Strategist. Thank you and have a good day.